conflict. And America starts to invest money in Iran, and there's all kinds of cultural interchange, and we've become much closer together. You know what? I think that's actually a very effective strategy for regime change, because what this Iranian regime can't really withstand, given its totally discredited, very oppressive political system, is actually a lot of interaction with the West. And I think the reason the Iranians might not ultimately cut that deal is that Ayatollah Khamenei knows that if he were essentially to accept the embrace of the West, this Cold War with Iran were to end, it actually would be a vehicle for precisely the kind of integration with the West that would lead to the end of his regime. And that, I think, is in some ways the irony at the heart of what's going to make this deal so difficult to pull off.
The opportunity just to reflect on what one another said, and certainly either in your closing remarks referred directly to some of the things that you were talking about, but you raised something that you didn't, which is really, or challenges something you said regarding the end goal here. You said the end goal is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and sort of, couched many of your remarks in that. But Peter, at the very end of what you were saying, through what I think many people believe is another end goal here into the mix, that of regime change. So
yeah, I think I agree fully with what Peter said as far as the most effective regime change strategy would be to resolve the conflict between the United States and Iran, and to force the Iranian leadership to deal with integration and better relations with the West and free interchange of ideas. It's ironic, a lot of our strategy towards Iran actually runs counter to this. Our strategy towards Iran is isolation, it's sanctions, it's trying to convince the Iranians to come to the table to end its isolation, when the reality is that Khamenei and the Iranian regime actually thrives in isolation. The Iranian population is overwhelmingly young people. It's, I think, 65% of the population is under 30. In 2009, the way that the Green Movement facilitated its demonstrations was through social media, through internet communications, and it turned out that a lot of those communications were actually, a lot of the tools that they used were actually sanctioned by the US government. So Iranians didn't have the kind of wide access to social networking tools that could have helped facilitate that movement. So I think that this is clearly a policy that is producing unintended results that actually, ironically, there's a sort of symbiosis between the US policy and the Iranian government's policy. And it is going to be a matter of, there is this obstacle of, does the Iranian regime imagine itself as so opposed to the West that it couldn't break a deal with the United States that could potentially open it up to this kind of interchange? I don't think we've tested that. And I think it's important that we do. The fact that we've only had 2 bilateral meetings with the Iranians since Obama took office, we have not had any kind of sustained diplomatic process until now, demonstrates that we haven't tested this proposition. And I think that the other problem here is that the Iranian government does view the US efforts, does view the end goal not as preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which I think we should look very closely at the fact that the Supreme Leader has said he issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons. See, they repeatedly say we don't want a nuclear weapon. It goes against Islam. They're not saying they want to pursue a nuclear weapon. But in these negotiations, they view the ultimate goal as regime change. And they actually perceive the nuclear issue as a useful buffer to other issues that could be raised by the United States, particularly human rights, where the government wouldn't necessarily be able to say this is a matter of national pride that we're holding fraudulent elections and throwing our people in jail. this is actually a matter that puts us in a very poor light and very bad footing domestically. Instead, we're going to allow this confrontation with the United States to take place over the nuclear program, which is, in many respects, a matter of national pride. If the Iranians continue to judge that the U.S. goal ultimately is regime change, and no matter what they do on the nuclear front, there's still going to be some issue that is used as a source of confrontation in order to push a regime change agenda, then they're going to have no incentive to address the nuclear issue and gradually, hopefully, work towards addressing the other issues that we have with Iran.
Peter, can you take some of this, what Sharon was talking about, what people on the street may think, age of the population, what's going on inside Iran, and everything you were saying about the psychology of the Israeli public in particular, or general, or politicians in particular, do they care? Does any of this resonate with people in Israel or their supporters here in the States?
It's hard. I mean, there seems to be a kind of strangeness about the Israeli debate about Iran. I mean, in the sense that you don't get a sense, even reading the Israeli press, that the Israelis are obsessed by this topic. The topic that people were obsessed with in Israel in 2009 really was about domestic issues, and it's really been domestic issues, I would say, that have been at the forefront, I would say, of probably Israeli political life in the last couple of years. So I guess the way I would describe it is I don't think that Israelis are going to sleep at night fearful of Iran as the next Nazi Germany. But I do think they are they're open. They can be those are latent fears that exist within the political culture. I would say that can be produced if the government really pushes very, very strongly. I think in terms of the question about democratization in Iran, Israeli political culture in general has tended to be, I would say, skeptical, perhaps one might even say cynical, about the idea of democratization in the Middle East. I think one of the reasons that things that people get really wrong when they tend to see, sometimes you find on the left, there's this kind of equation of neoconservatives in the United States with Israelis. And actually, neoconservatives and Israelis can often see things quite differently. Neoconservatism is an American-born movement which shares a lot of historic American optimism about the potential for democracy and liberty around the world. And so you saw people like Elliot Abrams and Paul Wolfowitz embracing, for instance, the Arab Spring when it broke out a year ago. The Israeli reaction was very, very skeptical from the very beginning. And I'm not necessarily sure that Israelis are nearly as enchanted by the idea of a democratization movement in Iran as Americans tend to be. And I think that there's a little bit of more of a kind of a cultural fatalism that tends to exist in Israeli political discourse. Why that exists is interesting and complicated, especially when you recognize that actually such a large percentage of the Israeli Jewish population actually hails from that part of the world itself, right? I mean, Shalom Mofaz, who just entered the Israeli government, is himself born in Iran. There are a lot of Israeli Jews born in Iran and also places like Iraq and Morocco, Yemen, and others. And yet the Israeli political discourse has never tended to be, with the exception of Nathan Sharansky. Nathan Sharansky is really the one Israeli political figure who sounds very American in his belief that democracy will solve the problems of the Middle East. So George W. Bush loves his book so much. But basically, Sharansky is not a perspective that has a lot of currency in Israel. And I think if I had to speculate, I would say it actually comes from a more deeply rooted historic Jewish suspicion of mass movements. I mean, if you look at the historic way that Jews survived in diaspora, generally what Jewish communities did was they looked for protection to the elites, the princes, the kings, the people who saw Jewish economic value, the people who could be bought off. It was actually the peasantry, it was the people below, it was the masses that you feared most in a place like Ukraine or Poland or wherever. There's a lot of interesting writing by Henry Kissinger, how this influenced his own views, but I'm going pretty far afield. But I think that actually this skepticism of mass movements in the Middle East is kind of ingrained in Israeli political culture and influences the way they see the possibility of democracy in Iran.
So
let me sort of spin this back to you. And one thing you did mention in your commentary about what's going on inside Iran is sort of, how do they consider the Israeli, a political agenda, or how Israelis perceive what's going on in Iran? We have this notion that everybody in the world pays attention to this little piece of territory and what the people there think. Is this something serious? Is this just a political, a gambit that Ahmadinejad uses when he says we're going to take Israel off the map, or is this a serious, agenda item inside Iran?
So the first thing I would say is that I think that a lot of the threats of military action by Israel have not necessarily resonated in Iran. There seems to be a prevailing view that these are bluffs and that Israel is not going to strike Iran, but that the United States might strike Iran. So I think that if you want to look at what's motivating the political actors inside of Iran, it's the Israeli strikes are viewed as pressure on the United States to ratchet up sanctions and to potentially strike Iran. As far as the threats or the rhetoric that Ahmadinejad is engaged in, we need to be careful to not feed into what his agenda is, which, these kinds of statements, as much as they resonate here, as vile as they are, as much as they are viewed as threatening, for Ahmadinejad, they're carefully calculated political tools to consolidate his power, to use against his political enemies. And when we in the United States seize on these comments and give Ahmadinejad more credence than he actually deserves, we do actually play into what he's trying to achieve. Right now, Ahmadinejad is not a figure with a whole lot of power in Iran. He's the president, a president who doesn't have control over foreign policy, doesn't have control over the military, and though he may have had more influence early on in his tenure, right now, his wings have basically been clipped by the supreme leader, and he's the lamest of lame duck presidents. He has extremely limited maneuverability. He can hardly pass a budget. But he definitely uses the reaction to these statements on the world stage to create an image of himself that's more aggrandized and that he brings back home to show how much influence he has on the world stage. Early on in his tenure, some of these statements that he made were actually used against his political opponents, against the Larajanis, who are a powerful political family in Iran. At the time, he was struggling with one of the Larajani brothers, who was the chief nuclear negotiator, who was actively pursuing a deal to resolve the nuclear dispute with the Security Council, with the United States, with the IAEA. And Ahmadinejad thought that this was too conciliatory an approach and really went out of his way to try to undermine any hopes of resolution of that issue. We see that this has, the shoe is now on the other foot, where the Larajanis have actually worked to undermine Ahmadinejad as he now has sought to find a resolution to the nuclear dispute in the past couple of years, because he's viewed that as a potential way for him to gain domestic political support. And if he could get a deal with the United States, he thought that he could actually salvage his political career. And so you may remember several months ago there was Iranian Basiji, these Iranian sort of militias ransacked the British embassy and basically led to the British leaving Iran, closing down their embassy. And a lot of people didn't realize that this was actually at a time when Ahmadinejad was working to get the British ambassador to Iran accredited, and was hoping to use this as a stepping stool to more dialogue and to actually enhance this relationship. And this was a deliberate tactic by Larijani to undermine that process, expel the British. And all that we saw on the news was, here's Iran being Iran when people are rioting at the British Embassy, without understanding this political dynamic that was happening. And this was really a matter of jockeying for influence among political actors. So I think we do need to make sure that we are aware of what motivates the political actors inside of Iran, and that we don't allow this infeuding between these actors to prevent us from taking a rational approach to the issues at hand that can actually solve our goals, instead of addressing political rhetoric made by hardliners that is only meant to embolden hardliners inside of Iran.
Before we go on to the questions from the cards, about 10 minutes that I can indulge myself in some of the questions that I have, and maybe get you to speak a little bit outside of the box that we've just put together. And I would sort of pose it this way, and you both can comment on it. This discussion tonight is sort of framed in engaging Iran without war. But one can certainly make the case that while we're not militarily engaged, we are already in many ways in the state of war, particularly with respect to the cyber war that's out there. And one could argue that, should that play out as a back and forth, not just with Iranian computers having been hit by who knows who actually did it, what would it really look like if that cyber threat comes inside the US and the capacity that that has to really bring things down here? One can argue that sanctions are already creating that savers. And from a historical perspective, all sorts of things have been used as casus belli to bring people to military conflict by someone making the claim, we are at war, even though no one has fired a shot, here we are. Because it's not, one would argue, to reiterate a point that I raised earlier, it's not about simply preventing you from getting a nuclear weapon. At the end of the day, the goal on the Western side, the American side, the Israeli side, is regime change. And so whether it's a military